The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. And now, here's Reverend Sue.
Got joy in my soul. God is in control. I got Satan on my trail, but I'm singing all is well. He's attacking every day, but I'm watching while I pray. No matter the attack, I won't turn back.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening. We have a special guest, and this evening we're going to talk to Journey Harris. Journey is a fellow at Design Trust for Public Space. She's a graduate of Howard University and an incoming student at MIT pursuing her master's in city planning. So, Journey Harris, thank you for joining us today. And we are so excited that you took time out of your busy schedule to just talk to us about public spaces. I'm sure that throughout my career or my life, I've looked at public spaces. I've been a part of public spaces, but never really had a formal conversation. This is not really a formal conversation, but a conversation about public spaces. I just took advantage of it, and I saw a bench here and a park here, but never thought about what went into providing us with public spaces. You have traveled all over the world. I know a little bit about you. You travel all over the world, many countries, and still you came back to the United States to pursue your master's degree in public spaces. So what is public space to you?
Thank you for having me, first of all. I love how you said that you probably interacted with public space throughout your life, because I do think that while there's a general definition of public space, we all have some kind of personal definitions that we prescribe to it. So to me, public space is the places where people are able to gather with one another. They are accessible and they promote social activity, whether that is political organizing or worship or fellowship or having fun. They're typically places where people can exist with others outside of their home or their work or their school. So it's kind of like that. People call it a third space outside of where we typically spend our time. And yeah, I love public spaces, and I'm really excited to talk to you more about it.
Yes. So why is public space important in our communities, specifically to African American and other people of color?
Yeah, I think I'll refer to the pandemic. And I'll just take us back to that moment of being in quarantine and isolation to answer that question. A lot of us dealt with loneliness when we were forced to stay at home and we weren't able to access public spaces or do our normal daily routines with other people. It affected us mentally, emotionally, and even physically. And so I think public spaces are really important to our community because they offer an opportunity for us to be social, which is really important for our health as human beings. Another thing I want to highlight about public spaces, why I think they're so important for Black people in particular, is because public spaces they are the location of economics, believe it or not. And I live in New York now, and so you might hear motorcycles passing by on our public spaces and streets out here. But it's a source of economics, right? A lot of people have their first jobs on the streets, right? When I lived in Columbia Heights in DC, there's a Target, a Chick-fil-A, and some other restaurant there. And directly across from there is a woman who sells slices of mangoes. And there's also a woman who sells phone cases, and there's a woman who sells masks. And so walking through that area, I realized that a lot of Black people and a lot of people of color find alternative ways to make money through our public spaces, whether that's, working on the streets, whether that's being in a plaza, we find ways to make money. And so I think public spaces are really essential to our community because it's an opportunity for Black people to develop and nurture an entrepreneurial spirit outside of the traditional norms of work, such as working in an office building or working in a school or working in a corporate environment. There's so much value in being able to work in a space and make money in a space and be a part of, the system that we have in a place where people are already walking or already spending time. So those are a couple of reasons why I think they're important for our community. It's good for our health and it's a part of our economics.
Thought about something and I would like to express this. I remember, I still today, you see the young boys hanging on the corner, and there could be one bitch there, but you see about 5 or 6 out there hanging on the corner talking, and so many people automatically think that they're up to something that is negative. Perhaps that was their space. They left their home and in so many areas that limited space, and they go out and talk and share and do so, but not negative, not all the time negative, or planning who they're going to rob or who's going to do this. Perhaps that was their public space that they had.
And since living in New York, I've been around a lot of people who come from immigrant families, and culturally, a lot of immigrant families might live in one house where there's a lot of people in the home. So if a young person needs to be able to find, their sense of independence and express freedom, the best place to do it is in a public space, because sometimes your home is not the safest or most ideal place for you to be a kid, be a teenager, or even be an adult. Sometimes you need to break away from your family. Sometimes you need to break away from those 4 walls that you get so familiar with. So places like parks, places like plazas, even sidewalks, like walking down the street, going for walks to get food or to see a friend, or even people hang out on their stoops here. People hang out, in their front areas where it might be a sidewalk. Like I'm looking across the street right now, there isn't a proper stoop, but there's a sidewalk where sometimes people will set up a grill and they'll hang out and they'll eat food and they'll laugh and they'll play music. And it's a nice escape from what we're often used to within our home. So, yeah.
So when you have an exhibit, say for instance, a public library, and people have an opportunity to just be a part of that community and come, have you experienced that in New York?
Yeah, I have. I actually helped produce an exhibition at the Brooklyn Public Library, and it was absolutely phenomenal. Of course, putting things together as a producer, so to speak, there's a lot of nitty-gritty work that is all worth it once you see people gathering in a space and being able to bond and connect and look at the art on the wall. So it was a photographer who was the artist behind the exhibition named Barnabas Crosby. And the way people gathered to talk about his work and to say, oh, wow, like that's really interesting, and have conversations. It was a beautiful experience, because oftentimes, and this is my art nerd side coming out, but oftentimes that experience of being in a gallery or an exhibition is preserved for a certain type of audience, right? You might have to come dressed a certain way. You might have to know certain people in order to have access to that exhibition. But the great thing about public spaces, such as a public library, is the boundaries and the walls are kind of broken down, and that experience becomes accessible to anybody. So you can have somebody who is houseless who could come to the library because that's what they do every other day, and they happen to see this art exhibition, this installation, and they happen to see the artist there and the artist's family, and they happen to see other art lovers talking about it. And now it's not an us versus them kind of scenario. Rather, it's a very collaborative and community oriented experience when people can come into a public space to enjoy art. So I think public art is also a big part of public space. And you see a lot of that in DC, from statues to, art on the ground, murals. That's also a part of how we beautify public spaces.
Now, this is something I thought about talking about public spaces, that from a policy determination perspective, how does public policy determine who has access to public space? Or it just automatically happen? Put it there, and the people within the community has it. But people who are not in the community, you publicize it, you market it, and they are welcome to come as well. So public space is positive but it doesn't matter who it is or where they came from. Right.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting you said that, because I do believe people create their own public spaces. There are some public spaces that are intended on being for the public. Like, let's say there's the grand opening of a new park or a new green space. That's intended to be a public space. Like, you know, somebody organized it. There was probably policy and movement and organization around it.
Mm-hmm.
But just like I was saying, as far as across the street, people using the sidewalks to grill and to set up chairs and to hang out, that's a form of, I'd call it organic public space, people creating a public space. The space was already there, but it becomes public once people use it and when people feel comfortable in those spaces. So I think that's a really interesting point. There is those spaces intended for the public, and there's those spaces that people make public, and they're both really important.
And I will not get into this, I promise, but I'll just make a statement about when Howard University had their public space, and that was the yard.
Mm-hmm.
And then they had some situation going on. Other people wanted to, have the dog in their public space, so they made their own public space, a private university. However, they made their public space, and that was not necessary. They made the definition of public space,
right?
I was thinking about all the public spaces here in Washington.
Yeah, that's so true. That I think that was always a public space. The yard has always been a public space, but the use of the public space changes depending on who's using it and how they think of the public space. So a student or an alumna or a faculty member at Howard would see the yard and know that it's a place of gathering specifically for those in the Howard community. They know that it's a place where we hold vigils. If there's someone in the community who has passed, the vigils are held right there by the flagpole. Mm-hmm. It's a place of worship. People come and sing there and do performances there. But outside of that Howard community, which is what you're referring to, people mm-hmm. who are walking their dogs or kind of treating the space as if it was a public park, they too used it as a public space. So they're not wrong for using it as a public space, but the intention was incorrect. And, you know, some public spaces can and should be reserved as holy and sacred and mm-hmm. special to people. Mm-hmm. But, you know, people might say that about statues, you know, the statues of Confederate soldiers that are all around America that people have started tearing down or tagging. They might hold reverence to some people, and it's public, so it's for all to enjoy or see. But yeah, the meaning of public space, it changes depending on what you know about it and your intentions and how you use it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's one thing going to churches, just a little bit on churches, being a minister in church. Urban churches all around Washington, D.C., and is it an advantage to discuss public spaces with our members in the church to make us aware? I mean, we take advantage of it, but to make us aware of from a political perspective, and see if we make sure that we do have public spaces in our community, and not utilizing it for all buildings, and so we can't use it. I mean, the land is so precious now. Everybody wants a piece of land. Mm-hmm. And what I'm looking at is that I just read that Brooklyn is becoming Manhattan. So Washington, D.C. is building buildings. Is any way that our churches can get involved to make sure that we have public spaces for our community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think public spaces will always be there because there will always be a space that exists in between someone's home, someone's work, and someone's school. You're going to have to take the street to go to work, you know, you're going to have to use the sidewalk to go to the grocery store. So public spaces will always exist. Now, when you talk about public green spaces, places where there's trees, where people can really cater to their health and their mental and physical health in these green spaces, because it's good for us to be among trees and nature and everything. Mm-hmm. I think there is an importance in the church talking about that. I think churches should also continue what they are doing with public spaces. So I know your church has a ministry of bringing food to people who may not have food, who might be on the streets. Like that is their home. The public space is kind of like their private space, so to speak. I think it's important to continue those kinds of ministries. And as far as the political aspect, I think churches can do a really good job of educating members about what public space is so that they can have an emotional attachment to certain places and therefore advocate for it. So going back to the Howard University situation, the reason why it got on the news is because students feel so passionately and so attached to that space. And so it made them angry to see that space being abused or misused. I think we should have that same kind of passion when it comes to green spaces. We should say, no, this is important to my community. I come here when I need a breather. I come here to walk my dog. I come here when my kids want to play and not be in the house. And churches can play a role in advocating for those kinds of spaces, but it would start through education.
Mm-hmm. There was during the time when in Kenosha, Wisconsin, a while back, when a young man killed, just went and shot and killed, I think 2 men. And what happened, they had a protest there. But what happened with the residents, I interviewed a couple of people there, and what happened with the residents, they said, no, the residents did not destroy the statue in the park. I said, well, why have you know? Because not one resident of Kenosha would do that. That's our history. That's our love. We love that statue. We would never destroy that. So that's why they knew the people was coming from the outside of Kenosha and not the people within inside.
Yeah.
So if you can take a public space and it become a historic site.
Mm-hmm.
With the love. And that's really good. So I know that you're busy, and I was looking at your resume that you start traveling when you're 3 years old. You went for your first trip to London, and then you've been visit India. And I'm not going to think of all the other countries that you have visited. And now you're getting ready to pursue your continue your education with a master's degree at MIT. With that, what do you? Number one, the first question is, how do you become so passionate when it came to public spaces?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And what are you planning to do in the future? What do you like to do in the future?
Yeah, I have family, you included, and my mom, who honestly, so many of my family members have introduced me to parks and museums and libraries. So I've always spent a lot of leisure time growing up outside of my home, in places, in public spaces. I didn't know there were public spaces at the time. Like I'd go to Losco Park in Jacksonville, Florida, and I'd go to Jacksonville Beach when I lived there. I didn't realize those were public spaces. It was just a part of the environment around me. And those are places that I really loved because I realized that I have a love for nature. And so I think my interest in public spaces started there when I was a kid, like just being a kid and growing up in a place like Florida, you have a lot of outdoor activities. So I was biking all the time. I was walking all the time. I became familiar with the environment outside of my home. Mm-hmm. And now I can acknowledge that those were public spaces that really helped me socialize. They helped me learn about the world around me, right? I got to learn about the way people interact when I went to the malls, right? That's another form of public space, going inside malls. A lot of teenagers would hang out in the food court or just walk around the mall. And that's how people gained social skills, myself included. So I think my interest started there. And where I'd like to go with this, well, I'd like to get certified as an urban planner. And I'd like to continue to travel because I think traveling does inform the way that I appreciate cities, but I'd love to bring that appreciation and that certification and education to cities in the South because I think they deserve a lot of love and attention and passion. And I think I have a lot of passion to bring to Southern cities. As much as I love living up north, I think the South is very special when it comes to my heritage and so many other Black people's heritage. And so I'd love to work with cities in the South and improve them so that all people can enjoy them.
And with that, with your experience just in New York or here in Washington, D.C., you've seen some positive things about public space, and you also seen some negative things about public space. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think the negative thing, I'll start with the positive.
Right,
Positive
right.
thing about public space. The way that culture gets exchanged in public space is so beautiful. Going to a market and being able to experience foods that are not of my culture, but are really delicious, really tasty. It helps me have appreciation for that culture, and it helps me learn more about people from that culture. And I think a lot of people have that experience, especially in New York and DC, where it's so multicultural. Going to farmers markets, that might be in public spaces. That's an example of just being able to try new things. So I think it makes people adventurous. And I think it gives us a sense of belonging when we're able to fellowship with one another in public space. Like the feeling that we get when we go to church and we get to fellowship inside of a building, mm-hmm. Public spaces offer that to people outside of the context of church. So that's a positive thing that I've seen in DC and in New York, that cultural exchange. I will say that at times developers and planners can use public spaces and can get so excited about the beautifying of them and can beautify. And by beautify, I mean, put up murals or artwork and cool statues and design elements. There can be so much excitement around the beautification. And sometimes it happens so quickly that it doesn't fully agree with or align with the needs of the community around it. If a community really needs access to grocery stores and fresh foods and fresh vegetables, having a mural doesn't really help. It might make it look beautiful. And sometimes the intention behind beautifying certain places is that it encourages people to have a sense of pride and excitement about these spaces. So that reduces crime and violence. That's the intention. But I think it's important that before beautifying public spaces, be in communication with community to figure out what is it that people really need and how can public spaces help to serve those needs. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's one negative, but there's a solution around that. And it's all about communication and really being attentive to people, because should we be holding spaces above people? No, we should definitely be honoring people and the needs and wants of people, and then relating that to the spaces that are around them.
And I also think that going back to, I always talk about voting. Voting is always in my consciousness, that we have to be very active or proactive in parking versus bike lanes. And in Washington, D.C., I don't have a parking space because I got bike lanes. Mm-hmm. So we have to be conscious of, is that fair? And that comes back from a political perspective, to be very aware of what's happening to you in reference to losing your public space. Mm-hmm. Well,
and even to that word of fairness, because I'm at Design Trust for Public Space, I'm an equitable public space fellow. So my role and my responsibility is to think about what is fair, what is equitable to all. And in that fairness, it's hard to come to a conclusion about what is fair if you're only isolated in your own thoughts. So then again, that element of communication and community and like listening and asking questions and listening again, that really plays a role so that we can come to some great solutions for as many people as possible when it does come to public space.
That's good. We need you. And thank you. We need you very much in this country so you can make a difference in our communities. And Journey, we thank you so much for the work that you're doing and you did in DC, at Howard University, and also moving to New York and making a difference in New York as a fellow there in public design. So we thank you so much. And I know that you're going to do a fantastic job at MIT and make a difference also in Massachusetts, wherever you go. So may God bless you and continue to use you in such a powerful way. Just one word or one sentence that you want to leave our listeners today.
Lead with love and do all things with love.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And our listeners, let's love, and let's continue to pray and be conscious of our environment, to go out and make a change, to go out and make a difference. And may God bless you. And thank you, Journey Harris, for being with us. May God bless you.